Okay, this is point 3. This is probably the most important point. This is an argument for the existence of God, and not just any God, but the theistic God. So this video covers points 3, 4, and 5. That God exists. If God exists, miracles are possible, and miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. I hope this is challenge and encouragement to you here on the Bible Professor.
So generally, these arguments would fall into kind of more philosophically oriented, from say like a Thomas Aquinas, to a more scientifically oriented that I think you find more popular. And I gravitate towards the latter because it resonates a lot more with just a general audience. So like, for example, the famous Kalam cosmological argument that William Lane Craig made famous says basically whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And the bulk of the argument, it focuses on that second premise that the universe began to exist. Most people are not going to throw out the concept of causality because that would throw out really all the natural sciences. So they're willing to grant if something comes into existence, it needs some kind of cause for that. So then the onus is on the arguer, the theist, to argue how we know that the universe began to exist a finite time ago. And there are a number of scientific views that are fairly standard. Things like the Big Bang Theory, which basically says that as far as we can trace back the history of the universe, it hasn't existed eternally. That's one argument. Another one is the concept of entropy, the idea that energy basically runs down. Things just run down unless you have energy input. You have to plug your phone in, otherwise the battery will go down. So if the universe had been existing from eternity, it would have run down by now. So the idea is then it must have just started a finite time ago, however long that is, whether it's just 1,000 years, several thousand years as a young earth creation would say, or billions of years as an old earth creation would say. That's relatively indifferent to the point of the argument, namely the universe began to exist a finite time ago. So then you have to conclude, well, if it began to exist and something can only begin to exist if it has a cause, then the universe must have a cause. But what's interesting about the conclusion that might not be obvious from the two premises of the argument is that if the cause of the universe caused the universe to come into existence, what it's causing to come into existence is time, space, and matter, the ingredients of the universe, which means whatever the cause is then has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. And it's like one of those things, well, if it's got feathers and a bill and it quacks and web feet, it sounds like a duck to me. And I think a lot of people in the general marketplace would say, look, if you're telling me there was some cause that made the universe come into existence, that sounds like God to me. I mean, who else is in the business of causing universes? Every once in a while, you might run into a Richard Dawkins type that will still be, intransigent and say, well, it doesn't mean it's God, blah, blah, blah. And there are other things to pile on as far as arguments to how we know this being is personal, how we know it's good, and things like that. But I think a lot of times in the marketplace, if you can convince somebody that whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, you're well on your way, I think, of establishing theism.
Is there another one of the main arguments that you're more passionate about?
There are. For example, you can also appealing to the science, you can start appealing to certain characteristics of the universe. So this is not talking about it coming into existence, but having an existence that has certain characteristics that all point to the notion of intelligence. If you're walking along the beach and you see the sand and the seashells strewn out relatively patterned, big shells closer to the water's edge, but as you go up the beach, the shells on the beach get smaller and smaller. You can explain that by just the normal action of the waves. Heavier shells fall out of the waves faster, so they're closer to the water's edge, but the water can carry lighter shells up the beach, so that's why there's a seeming pattern, but you don't need to appeal to anything other than just the forces of nature, the tide, the wind, and these kind of things to explain it. But as you continue to walk on the beach and you run across John Loves Mary scrolled into the sand, you wouldn't just wring your hands and try to figure out what kind of laws of nature and wind and waves and stuff would account for that, because it contains information, a specified complexity. And so everywhere we encounter information, we attribute it to an intelligence. So what scientists have discovered is that, for example, in biological systems, you have this immense amount of information coded in the DNA. And the most reasonable explanation of the presence of that information is intelligence. Now, if I had something here that I photocopied and it's got a lot of names and things listed on it, well, you can explain all of the information on here as far as the toner and stuff. You can explain that by the copy machine and the toner and all this. But what you can't explain by the copy machine is the actual information on that piece of paper. So yes, you can explain the DNA from previous physical processes and procreation and these kind of things. That's fine along with the laws of chemistry. But the information encoded in the DNA has to be caused by an intelligence. So if you've got a cause that caused the universe to come into existence, and then some of those things that exist are encoding information that everywhere else we would attribute to an intelligence, then it's reasonable to think must be the same cause that caused the universe to come into existence is the cause of the information encoded in biological systems. And there are others too, the fine-tuning of the universe, or rather, I should say, the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, make it such that life was even possible in the first place. But these various physical conditions that make life possible, biological life, are so immensely improbable from any known laws and stuff. In fact, they are the basis of the laws of nature, that the only way to explain how in the world could that be so finely tuned so as to have the universe the way that it is. Again, it must have been deliberately done. And even relatively agnostic, indifferent kind of scientists admit that this is probably one of the most theistic things to ever come out of science, is this idea of the origin of the universe and then the intelligent design of the universe.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Richard Howe. So point 3 says the theistic God exists. Point 4 says if God exists, then miracles are possible. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Absolutely. So it's so important in principle to establish theism to make the point that miracles are possible. Why does that matter? Because the case for Christianity specifically among competing theisms like, say, just Orthodox Judaism or Islam, the case for Christianity invariably appeals to historical events that are miraculous, not the least of which is the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. So you've got to be able to preempt objections that people may raise against the reliability of the Bible when they point out, well, it seemingly has these fanciful things. You got a donkey that talks, or a snake that talks, or an axe head that floats, or people rising from the dead. And they often will couch those objections as if, oh, that points to the historical unreliability and almost fairy tale-ish kind of flavor to the Bible. But if you've already established that God exists, then that can't be a historical objection to say, well, we know the Bible is historically unreliable because it has miracles. No, we've already preempted that objection to go, if there is a God, then that at least makes miracles possible. Now, that doesn't prove that they're actual yet. That's down the stream a little bit, downstream a little bit of making the argument that they actually did happen. But in my experience, both as a student and also as a professor, is very often the objections to the story of Jesus rising from the dead are always an objection that doesn't consider the fact that of whether God exists or not. And I've seen this actually in debate. When Kai Nielsen and J.P. Moreland debated the existence of God back in the 80s on my campus as an Ole Miss student, and I helped organize that debate, Moreland brought up the resurrection of Jesus as part of his argument for God's existence. To which Nielsen just said, okay, so maybe he rose from the dead, some kind of weird thing happened. That has nothing to do with whether God existed or not. His atheism preempted him from being able to see the cogency of the historical evidence for Jesus because he already had a prior philosophical objection that he needed to get settled first. And Moreland did the best that could be done to answer those objections. Hopefully it worked before Kai Nielsen passed away that he was able to see. But having said that, theism then establishes the possibility of miracles so that later we can give the historical evidence for the, not the least which of miracles is the resurrection of Jesus to prove that Christianity is true. One last quick point, if I may, Dr. Winstead, is that the value of the miracles, the reason they matter, they're not just interesting kind of things, but miracles confirm the message and vindicate the messenger. And so, just as people say, we know that you are of God, for no man can do the things that you do unless God be with him. People recognize that in Jesus's day, when Jesus walked on the water, and then when people preach that verse about, when they always focus on Peter, Peter walked on water and he took his eyes off Jesus and he sank. So don't take your eyes off of Jesus, or you'll sink in the storms of life. That kind of stuff.
Guilty.
Yeah, no, I as well. But what people sometimes leave out is the very last verse of that passage. What the point of the passage was, when Jesus did what he did, they say, this is the Son of God. They were able to recognize that his ability to do miracles confirmed the message he was preaching about himself, that he was from God and had a unique relationship to God because he was God in the flesh. That's the reason why the miracles matter in making the ultimate case for Christianity.
Wonderful. Okay, so that was point 5, miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. So we've got point 3, the theistic God exists, and as you mentioned, not just any God, the theistic God exists. Therefore, if God exists, miracles are possible, and point 5, miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. Dr. Howe, can you just give like a 1-minute summary or even review of what you've just shared with us?
So I think it's important, the days are gone, I think, in America, that we can just bank on the fact that people even understand who God is or whether God exists. Right. So we've got to make sure when we're giving the gospel, of course, we don't want to fix something that's not broken. So if people already think there's a God in some sense, okay, fine. But we've got to be prepared to be able to make the case for God, especially in light of the influence of people like a Richard Dawkins and other atheists in our culture, to make that case of why reason can demonstrate the fact that God does exist. And then once we know God exists, if you create a universe out of nothing by your omnipotent power, then it's no small thing to raise someone from the dead. Once you believe in that creation event, as our theistic arguments show, then it's no small thing to believe that miracles are possible. Then the question becomes a historical one, where we argue, are they actual? Did they actually happen? And that's where the evidence would come in terms of the historicity of both the Old and the New Testament, to show that we have enough historical evidence to demonstrate that Jesus was who he claimed to be by his working miracles that vindicated the message and vindicated the messenger.
So when you read the 12 points in Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, they go over the kalam, the ID arguments, the moral argument. I like the kalam because it's very succinct and straightforward. People normally can get that right away. And that's simply that everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. Pretty straightforward. Comes from the Islamic philosophers, honestly, and I think they're right with that. Bill Craig is known for that argument, and it's straightforward. It kind of brings together the cosmology aspect of that of apologetics as well as philosophy. So I will use that argument. I also use the first way of Thomas Aquinas a lot because we get a lot of bang for our buck there. It takes more to get into, but basically it says that everything is changing, and in order for a change to happen, you can't have something changing itself. It's got to have different kind of metaphysical aspects to it, like the potential to change and actually existing to be able to change. And if you have these different parts that make up things, you can't have one thing causing another going back forever. So you've got to arrive at a being that's not put together of these metaphysical parts. That's pure existence that's causing all the other changes. That's a difficult argument to grasp for a lot of people because it deals with categories that people aren't used to. The ID arguments are really good, that show that because of the design on every level, whether you're using a microscope or a telescope and everything in between, things are unbelievably designed. I think that practically is a strong argument. It is susceptible to some criticisms, like, well, it doesn't give you monotheism or creation ex nihilo and some things like that. The moral argument is that, there's a moral law, and there's got to be something objectively, quote unquote, other or external to humans to account for this moral law. So I think the moral law is embedded in our human nature, but given to us by God. So there are various kinds of arguments to show that a theistic God exists, namely a being that's the creator, he's personal and still involved in the world.
Dr. Huffling, I know you have debated atheists and others. What's on this issue of the theistic God exists, what's some of the feedback you've gotten from the people, your interlocutors on those debates?
Yeah, so there's been a couple of different levels. So you've got popular level atheists like Michael Shermer, for example, and a high level atheist like James Sturba from Notre Dame. When you get the more Shermer, new atheist kind of things, you get questions like, well, who created God? Really arguments that don't interact a lot with the philosophical foundations and reasoning for why we give these kind of arguments.
Okay, so the one guy, the one atheist you debated whose argument was, well, where did God come from? Dr. Huffling, what's your answer to that?
That's a popular objection to the God question. And if somebody asks that, what created God? I would say to them, if you think that God needs a creator, you don't know what I mean by God. So if our arguments are sound, meaning the premises are true, the logic is valid, then we're demonstrating a God that is necessary, infinite, and does not and cannot have a beginning or a cause, or he wouldn't be the kind of being we're arguing for. So I would say that God can't have a cause. If what we're saying again is true, logical, and valid and everything, then the God we're arguing for in point 3 is a being that exists necessarily and does not have a beginning, cannot have a cause or a creator, or he's not what we're arguing for. So the who created God objection just misunderstands what we're trying to say to begin with. And then, but most of my debates have centered on the problem of evil. And it's gone in different directions. And I didn't want to get into this issue, but I did years ago. Thanks to our good friend Adam Tucker at the school, who hooked me up with a debate with Michael Shermer on this topic, and then became friends with Jim Sturba from Notre Dame, who's a great guy. But yeah, so that's I think the biggest argument against theism in general is the problem of evil, and so we've had to go back and forth on that. Yeah,
Maybe
the problem of evil is the idea that, well, if you assume that God is all powerful, all knowing, all good, then evil shouldn't exist, but it does. And so the argument is that no such God exists. And there's different ways to answer that. Most people will take some kind of either a theodicy, which is trying to show why evil exists, or a defense, which tries to show that God's existence is not contradictory with evil. And so there are different facets to the problem. One is pastoral, as you know, being a pastor. And the other is simply apologetic in terms of God's existence. And that's where I've mainly focused, because for apologetics and these debates, it's been about God's existence. And so one of my arguments about this follows Brian Davies and Herbert McCabe, who argue that God is not the kind of being that we are, so we really can't put him in the moral categories that we're in. Therefore, he can't be judged. Kind of like Job. Job wanted to argue with God that he was unjust, basically, and all this. And so at the end of the book, God says, look, I'm God and you're not. You just have to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much the approach that McCabe and Brian Davies take, and that I take as well. And I think that demonstrates that the problem of evil doesn't disprove God's existence. It might raise some questions about why he allows evil, but and it doesn't deal with the pastoral problem, but it does deal with the existence of God.
Very good. So point 3 says, it is true that theistic God exists. You mentioned several of those, the cosmological, the Kalam argument specifically, and Aquinas's first way, number 1, I guess you call it. You mentioned the moral law, the ID, which is intelligent design.
Right.
If point number 4 says, if the theistic God exists, then miracles are possible. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's like C.S. Lewis said, that if you admit God, you can't disprove miracles. You can't say a priori that there's no miracles. You can't just say by definition, like Hume did, there's no miracles because we're not seeing them, or because as a wise person you should never believe them. So the point 4 says, if God does exist, then miracles simply are possible. And a miracle is just an act of God. So if God exists, he can act. Now this is for a theistic God, not a deistic God. So this is a God that's involved in the world. And we see this this is going to be in point 5. We see this in various ways, whether through prophecy, healings, the resurrection. We see that we have historical record of miracles happening. Of course, it's debated now as whether it happened. A lot of debate about that. But if God does exist, you really can't guarantee miracles don't.
Yeah, and then if God exists, then miracles are possible. And of course, Geisler, in his 12 Points book, 12 Points to Show Christianity is True, talks about what miracles are not and what miracles are. And that's a very important part of it, I think, as well. Point 5 says miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so if God does exist and therefore miracles are possible, because again, a miracle is an act of a God that we already proved that exists. We think we proved he exists. Then anybody can claim to be God. I can claim it. You can claim it. Anybody can claim it. That's not very unique. It's entertaining maybe, but it's not very unique for someone to say that. Some crazy people have said that and still do. What is unique is to be able to prove it. And so people will say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Of course, that's point 7. But anybody can claim it, but not everybody can prove it. And so the way that God can prove his message is from him is to authenticate the message with works that only a God can do, whether that's through prophecy, whether that's through various miracles that are happening. For example, we see most of the miracles happening around Moses and Aaron, Elijah and Elisha, and Jesus and the apostles. So we see a lot of miracles going on there, and they, especially what we see like with Jesus and Moses and everyone, that these miracles they're not just as Jesus said in John, signs and wonders just for entertainment's sake, but it's to authenticate a message that's from God. It's like Jesus said, if you don't believe me with the heavenly things, how can you believe with the earthly things? So God's giving us attestation that what he's saying is true because he's signing it with a miracle. The word, as you know, being the Greek guy, the word for miracle is the same word we get for sign. And so we kind of say that miracles are signs that point to something. So they're signs that point that the message is true because it's being authenticated with the fingerprint of God that only God can give. And that's ultimately going to be in the ministry of Jesus and his own resurrection.
Yeah, and that will take us into starting at point 6. You actually start talking more about the biblical text,
Right.
with the New Testament reliability and so forth. Dr. Brian Huffling, I appreciate it. Can you just take a minute to just sort of summarize or even review what you've just given us on points 3, 4, and 5 that show Christianity is true?
Yeah, so point 3 again says that it is true that the theistic God exists. So we have many ways of arguing that God exists philosophically. We have scientific arguments that are practically good. I think we have to have some kind of philosophical boost to get us to full-blown theism. We can look at intelligent design. We can look at the moral arguments, the Kalam arguments, various cosmological arguments, and they all show basically that what we have here in the world cannot account for itself, and we can't go backwards forever in causes. So we have to arrive ultimately at an infinite uncaused cause that's going to be God. And if that God exists, then he can do what he wants in the world, which is just a miracle, him being able to act in the world whenever he wants to, doing whatever he wants to. And then he can demonstrate that his prophets, his people that are representing him are representatives of him. We would say, back in the old times, people would have a signet ring, right? They would sign the wax with the ring. That's kind of God's way of signing something, saying, this is what this guy says, and I'm going to authenticate it with my signature by doing this miracle.
So we have, the 3 main arguments for God, which is the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and then the moral argument. And so when we and these are really also when it comes to talking to teenagers, once again, this is a defense of what the Christian worldview says.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the cosmological argument, I have found is so powerful for teenagers when you talk to them because they know they're taught the Big Bang Theory at school.
Mm-hmm.
They're taught that the universe had a beginning. They're taught about Einstein. They're taught about all these scientific truths, and they don't realize, man, that's actually what science shows us. Science shows us that the universe had a beginning. The cosmological argument is a powerful one with kids. That gives them the opportunity to say, hey, science does show this, because they're given this idea in the culture that science and religion, and this particularly the Christian faith, are at odds with each other.
The design.
So the teleological argument is going to say, there's apparent design in the world. When you look at DNA, when you look at, DNA is information. When you look at the world, there is design in the world. And if there is design, there has to be a designer. And so the teleological argument tells us that there has to be someone who designed the world Because when we look at it objectively, we have to say there is design. Even scientists will, atheist scientists will say, and I'm paraphrasing here, that they'll say, we have to remind ourselves that even though it looks like there's design in the world, that there is no design in the world. And so that's so contradictory. Yes. And then so that moral argument tells us that within our conscience tells us that there is objective rights and objective wrongs. And if there's objective rights and objective wrongs, that there has to be something outside of humanity, outside of humans, that says that there's a standard. There has to be a standard of good outside of humans. Because when we look at reality, when we look at the world, when we look at different ideas of what is right and what is wrong, there are differing ideas of what is right and wrong. And I talk to my kids a lot about just the difference of, Hitler and Mother Teresa, which we've heard so often. Hitler thought he was doing right. And there's a book, I think it's called The Ethics, Hitler's Ethic, I think it's called. I can't remember, but I read it a long time ago. And the idea there was that Hitler was not trying to be evil. Hitler was trying to do what he thought was the best thing to do to keep his idea of the perfect human alive, or to advance the idea of the perfect human. And so his idea was that using, and of course, he also believed in natural selection. So his ethic told him that the right thing to do was to help along this idea of natural selection by killing those who were subhuman and were polluting the human DNA. And so with Hitler's ethic, his ethic was, yeah, these are subhumans, we can get rid of them. Mother Teresa's ethic said, all humans are created in the image of God, therefore all humans should be taken care of. So which is true? If there is no moral standard outside of humans, then what Hitler did becomes an opinion.
Mhm.
It doesn't become objective truth. Then when they were tried at the Nuremberg trials, and they were tried for crimes against humanity, it's because somehow, they had to appeal to a law that was higher than Germany's laws, than America's laws, because what they did was a crime against humanity. It wasn't a crime in Germany. And so the moral argument tells us that within every human, there is a conscience. There is an idea of objective right and objective wrong, that there are things that are evil and there are things that are good. And so that standard of goodness is given to us through the moral law by telling us that there has to be a moral lawgiver from which we have to compare things that we call evil to. And so that's where we would get an objective idea of morality.
Where do we start? This is one of the most common objections that you'll hear uninformed atheist level at Christians. There's no proof God exists. And to that, I sigh, because there is so much evidence that God exists. It may not be the Christian God. We have to work to that exclusivity. But our God, undeniable. Two of the most obvious things, no, three, I'll say. Three that are the most compelling to me. And there are multiple arguments to support this. And each apologist is going to have their preferred ones that they find most compelling. For me, long before I studied apologetics, it was the design argument, the teleos, the teleology of our creation around us. I felt whenever I had a moment of pause, like, well, could evolution be true? Could there be a natural explanation for everything we see around us? And I would just look at the intricate details of a flower and think to myself, that cannot be by accident. It cannot be. Even from an evolutionary standpoint, where God is not involved. Sure, survival of the fittest, the strongest plants could survive and create these plants that function and live and breathe, but that doesn't explain the beauty. Why the beauty? Why the artistic elements? There's a person that appreciates not only structure and engineering and purpose. Like, these aren't just plants that exist for no purpose. They're woven into a greater fabric of nature and ecology. And then on top of that, he could have just made it completely utilitarian, completely functional without bows and ribbons and color. But he didn't do that. He added sense and color and just all these pieces. For me, always takes me right back to God is the best explanation. From a logical perspective, it makes no sense. And this tends to kind of blow people's mind a little bit, because the thought of eternity and some kind of realm in which time doesn't exist, where there's no beginning, no end, that feels a little overwhelming to us, because we're not there yet. We live in a very structured, time-sensitive world right now. But simply working backwards, logically speaking, with no beginning to this place that we call home, it doesn't make sense. Everything, it's the law of causality. So everything around us we see is produced by a cause. The cause produces the effect. This is, again, basic logic. There is not a single thing in nature or outside of nature that we can speak of that suddenly appears without a cause. So all this universe around us isn't eternal. We know it's not eternal, again, simply by looking at nature. Things die and then they are reborn. And they're not reborn in a reincarnation type of way, but the next generation appears. We also see that each generation is not necessarily getting stronger, certainly not in the animal kingdom and humanity. Our genes and everything tend to be degrading over time, like a photocopier makes copies of things. We had to have started with a supreme, healthy, flourishing environment for us to still be here at this point.
Right.
We need a cause for that. The only thing that explains the beginning of time and materiality is something that exists beyond time and the material. Because if you are material, now you need a cause. And you just keep working backward and backward into an insane infinitum of regress. So that, to me, is also very compelling for why we need a first cause that's uncaused. And we call that being God. And then the last would be the argument for morality. We all intuitively know that certain things are right and other things are wrong. And the more you try and justify it using relativism, like we discussed a little earlier, when it comes to morals, it just doesn't add up. As soon as you find one moral absolute, different cultures will have certain preferences and customs that can change, and that's not a big deal. But if every single society can agree that it is never okay to murder an innocent life or to harm babies just for the fun of it, all you need is one moral absolute, and now you have a moral law. And the moral law requires a transcendent moral law giver, always.
Phoenix, can you go a step further than you seem to have given great evidence that the theistic God exists, but how do we know it's this kind of God we find in the Bible? What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, by looking two really, really clear examples for me that help me, and like this isn't my territory, there are great thinkers that came before me that I've learned from, is working backward from the material things we see and feel and working back to what kind of cause would produce that. So, for example, to produce an intricate, detailed, beautiful world that we see around us, it has to be more than just a force or just some distant, unemotional God that doesn't really care for his creation. You can see that everything is designed and built for man to flourish here. So this is a supernatural being with a plan, with a peak to his creation, that he wants the peak of that creation to flourish. So there's not only supreme intelligence, supreme power, supreme knowledge. We know that it must transcend time and space. We've already covered that.
Right.
But more than that, it is someone who appreciates beauty, appreciates truth. He wrote the laws of logic and the law of non-contradiction. And it's a one that values what's good and holy and beautiful. This is where we get the law for morality from. This is, for example, my pastor and friend, Dr. Bobby Conway, did his PhD thesis on the moral argument from guilt. And guilt is such a fascinating emotion and experience because, of course, it can be abused and there can be a false sense of guilt, and that's a different conversation. But just authentic guilt is only experienced when we do what? When we break the moral law. If the God of the universe is evil or corrupt or even has no real feelings about morality, why would we only feel guilt when we violate truth, when we violate life, when we violate beauty? It must be because the person or being that created those things values those things. And then the opposite is true. Why do we get a sense of comfort and warmth and joy when we help those things flourish? It must be because the creature, the being, the creator of those things also values them.
Dr. Roach, you are Dean and Professor of Theology and Philosophy at Veritas International University. You also do some teaching for Redeemer Seminary, and that's out on the West Coast. So anyway, just looking forward to hearing your thoughts and your expertise on the 12 points that show Christianity is true.
Well, I'm excited about it. I think it's a great thing. I think, in all honesty, the 12 points are probably one of the most concise and straightforward explanations one can give to go from nothing to proving that Christianity is true and that the Bible is the Word of God and Jesus Christ is the Son of God. All the key claims related to Christianity.
Yes, absolutely. So point number 3, you're going to start us off with maybe a couple of the arguments that the theistic God exists, a couple of them that you're passionate about. What do you have to say on that?
You know, I still think my two favorite arguments that were used in the classic 12 points explanation were the cosmological argument and the moral argument. And the cosmological argument is arguing for the beginning of the universe. So everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause. And what it's arguing for is that if there was a beginning to the universe based upon the law of causality, that every effect has a cause, then there must have been something that's distinct from the universe that brought the universe into existence. And that's specifically what we're trying to look at when we're talking about a theistic God, is that there's a distinction between the creator and the creation. The creation is finite, it's changing, it's something that hasn't always been here, whereas the creator, he's infinite, he's eternal, he's timeless. And that's one of the key things. We're not just trying to get to a generic God, we're getting to a specific understanding of a theistic God. And I think my second favorite form that they always gave within the classic 12 points was the moral argument. You know, every law has a lawgiver. There is a universal moral law. Therefore, there must be a universal moral lawgiver. And it's looking to the reality that, again, every effect has a necessary cause. And there is this reality of how it applies not just to the temporal world, but to the moral aspects of the world in which we live. And we see that given the fact that there is a moral law, we can see that which is good and that which is evil. We can distinguish between them. And in order to distinguish between them, there has to be some kind of objective standard. That's what the moral law is. And we see that in all the different ways that relativism breaks down and objective morality stands true. But here's the thing on why it's important. You know, what it's doing is it's not only giving us this idea of the distinction between the creator and the creation, like the cosmological argument did, but it's also giving us specific sort of positive properties about this theistic God. Namely, if there's morality here in the temporal world, there's morality in the divine being, in God himself. And God is now this infinite, eternal, simple being who's a moral being. And that just gives us a whole element in which we can rest on the trustworthiness of this God who has revealed himself in nature, and it distinctly lets us know that God exists and his character. And I think that's just something that's very unique to the Christian worldview.
Absolutely, and I like how you've tied the moral laws to the characteristics of God, because this is one thing that that also helps us in how I explain to students often when you're talking about the relationship of the Christian to the Old Testament law. You know, you have this tripartite structure: dietary, ceremonial, or civil, and then the moral. But the moral ones are the only ones that carry over, not for nothing and not capriciously or arbitrary on our part, but it's because the moral laws, as you said, flow from the character of God. They are unchanging.
Exactly. The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. There's not a discontinuity in the nature of God between the two testaments. There's continuity. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of Peter, Paul, James, and you and me. And that's one of the great things that we need to stand on, is that if this theistic God exists, that's the God of the Bible. That's the God we worship.
Dr. Roach, what about just a little pushback on the moral law argument before we move on to point 4? How do you answer, or what kind of problems do you run into? I know we get feedback or pushback sometime about the moral law, about, well, morality is just everywhere in culture. It's a social construct. It's not, yeah, it's universal, but that's just because everybody decides on certain things you shouldn't do.
I think the greatest reality of it is that we can use to push back against this is that there's a lot of theoretical relativists, but in push come to shove, they end up becoming absolutists. And
Right.
we see that given the cultural moment that we're in. We see people who have horrible events done to them. Like in the filming of this is the week in which Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And yes, there are crazies out there who are justifying it, but you have even some of the most hardened individuals who are looking at that saying there's something objectively wrong there. And when you see people who build a house making one set of claims and then they can't live consistently with those claims, that's exactly what Francis Schaeffer would talk about when he talks about taking the roof off of a particular worldview, and you can expose it exactly for what it is. And that's a strong argument for the consistency of the Christian worldview and the inconsistency of non-Christian worldviews. And what's interesting is that if we are nothing more than matter in motion, and there's no real moral element to us, then there's no difference between the classic example, taking, a can of Pepsi and a can of Mountain Dew and shaking them up, and whatever comes out is just a chemical reaction, and you may feel sticky or wet, but it's just matter in motion, versus when you take real moral beings and you proverbially shake them up and they have an issue that goes on and those molecules touch with one another, we realize there's a fundamental difference between human beings and real moral situations and something like Mountain Dew being spilt all over the streets. And namely, it's that true moral aspect that when moral wrongs are done, it's more than just matter in motion. And we take the roof off of that worldview and expose it for its a deep inconsistency in that worldview that they can't live according to really any given time.
Okay, exactly, Dr. Roach. So point 3 of the 12 points that show Christianity is true leads into point 4. If this theistic God exists, then miracles are possible. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Exactly. What it's talking about is this idea of, if this particular God exists, there are certain characteristics that are given to a God that's all powerful, all knowing, all good, all loving. And because there's a distinction between that being and creatures, we realize that we don't have the power to do whatever we want. And we don't always do the most loving things, and we don't always do the most wise things, but God always does. And that's part of what a miracle strives to do, is it tries to recognize that this intelligent being, this all-powerful being, this all-moral being can do something different than us. Namely, this God can do miracles. This God can do things that are not just contrary to what people would think they're going to do, but something that's very special into the world in which we exist, and that it's something so significant that we realize we can't do it in and of ourselves. Now, God has done miracles through people, but we recognize that it is God doing those miracles. And I think here's an analogy of it, is that this is getting just to the possibility of certain things being able to happen. And when we look at different people in this world, we recognize that different people, different like body types can do particular things because it's built into the nature of who they are. So for example, you look at, and this isn't a perfect analogy, but we see the difference where if you have an incredibly strong weightlifter that's at the gym and then like a scrawny guy, and they both get ready to go bench press 500 pounds, you're like, this one, it's, in one sense, it is possible. That one, it's not possible because strength and ability is in the one that's not in the other. And I think that's exactly how it looks like with this, is that there's the difference between God and creation is that for God, he can actually do these kinds of things, whereas the creation lacks the power to do them because it's not in our nature. But God can use people for miracles, but again, it's a divine miracle through the agency of people. It's not human beings just mustering something up in and of themselves.
Okay, and I think a lot of Christians probably don't understand the strength of this argument because it really goes far and wide with our biblical teaching, the issue of miracles, because so many people today, everything's a miracle, and that's such a problem.
If miracles happen all the time, then there's nothing special or unique about them. It just becomes like a natural feature of the world. And we realize this where it seems like the normalcy of something seems to downplay the special significance of it. In one sense, it's like, what's unique and what's special about waking up on Christmas morning and having presents? Well, it's because you don't get presents every other day of the year like that. And we see in a similar way that if miracles were just happening all the time, there wouldn't be any day-to-day significance to them, and there wouldn't be any specific theological significance to them because they point to something. They do something. There's something special about it.
Yeah.
Another analogy we could give is that if a man went out and gave every woman in his town flowers and then came home and gave his wife flowers, well, does that make his wife feel special? And the reality is that a good man will come home and bring only his wife flowers and deny all the other women in the town flowers in and of themselves because there's something unique. And in that way, we recognize that with the God of the Bible, is that God is doing something special and unique for a specific purpose that can't just be repeated willy-nilly in order to serve the needs of people's wants and desires, because God is the God who's in control of when, how he does miracles.
Dr. Roach, so if the theistic God exists, then miracles are possible. And then point 5, these miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. Can you explain that and just sort of tie that together?
Exactly. I mean, this is kind of what we were hinting at before, is that God has a purpose with miracles. And the reason that we see this is that this is really us trying to understand the unique nature of a theistic God who always acts with intention and purpose and wisdom and specificity. And here's a little other way that we can look at a theistic God exists as it relates to this. One of the classic arguments for the existence of God came from Aquinas' 5 ways. And one of those 5 ways is looking at what's known as final causality. And final causality is it's a fancy way for people saying that there's a purpose for which things are made. And when things are moving towards that purpose, we know that there was a God that was guiding and directing them towards a purpose in that regard. We see this all the time, and the final cause of a chair is to sit in. The final cause of the lawnmower is to mow the grass. The final cause of the car is to get from point A to point B. And the point is that God operates in the creation of this world according to these final causes and these purposes. So in one sense, we look at it, God doesn't give miracles apart from purpose. And that's why they're there to validate specific messages or messengers from God, because everything else God has done in creation has that. And miracles, because they're unique, have a very specific and unique way of communicating what they're trying to get across for a message or messenger. Now, I know this might be outside of the particular flow of the 12 points, but another reason that we say this is that we are people who actually read our Bibles. And we recognize that in the Bible, God will always validate or confirm his messengers with a particular message. Jesus confirmed his message with the resurrection. Hebrews 2 talks about how the apostles and Jesus were confirmed to us by miracles. We see that they are signs pointing to a purpose, that they are signals for a purpose. So when we look at the two aspects of this, God in his wisdom and the final causality of which he gives all things in creation, specifically very special things like miracles that happen in creation. And when we read our Bibles, we see that God is a God of order and purpose, and that miracles can and actually are used to confirm a message or messenger from God. The reason that we looked at this is that we're trying to argue for a specific understanding of God who does particular things. So we're arguing for a theistic God, which means there's a difference between God and creation. And we argue from the cosmological argument that God must be the unmoved mover, or he's the infinite, eternal, all-knowing being that brought all things into existence. And as a moral argument, we recognize there's objective morals, and that these morals reflect the Creator. So we recognize that God is a moral being who acts with all of his other attributes that we just discussed. And because this theistic God exists, it means there's something special about this God. It means that this God doesn't act just like creatures do. He acts according to what God would act like. And part of that is that this God has the ability to do miracles. And when and if God does a miracle, he acts with a specific purpose, which is to confirm a message or messenger of God. And that specific purpose is what makes them unique and what actually makes them of valid evidential support as we try to defend the historic Christian faith.
I think the evidence for God's existence, that we could prove God exists, is just so overwhelming. And so before I became a Christian, I challenged a Christian coworker, give me your best arguments for Christianity, and I'll show you what's wrong with it. And he brought me a little Christian apologetics book. I never even heard of the term. And it was a whole book packed with evidences. And so I started reading through it, and I started seeing, okay, I'm the one arguing the circle. I'm the one that the burden of proof is on me. It's not just on the Christian to actually make my case for atheism. And as I started examining all these great arguments for God's existence, things I had never heard of, never considered, I bought a couple other Christian apologetics books, and I was just overwhelmed. I couldn't believe the 25 the very solid arguments showing that God exists. And I walked away from that saying, okay, God definitely exists. I could trust the Bible. Jesus rose from the dead. And I asked my buddy, I said, what do I do now? I don't know what do I do with this? And
Okay.
read the scripture. Well, so some of the ones that really impacted me, the argument from design, especially having the science background with biology, looking, through the microscope at the cellular structures and so forth, seeing both the irreducible complexity and the specified complexity. So not only is it the case that if one of these mechanisms wasn't in place, the whole cell would die. So that's the irreducible complexity. The whole system has to be together for it to work. But beyond that, what blew my mind was the specified complexity, the information, the DNA. So one level of the information, the bottom level is just, okay, it's carrying this information with this double helix structure, which is just remarkable. But beyond that, the information itself was another layer of order, a higher layer of order that demanded explanation. So when you're looking at that, the amount of information on DNA is so overwhelming that we would have a hard time in our lifetime going through programming enough information as intelligent beings to actually design the body systems that is on a single cell of your DNA. So if we couldn't do that, what kind of creator do we have? how awesome is he? So, and that's all over all of creation. So again, testifying, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Psalm 19 resonating there, Romans 1 resonating. And it's like, oh my goodness, the argument from the people in the intelligent design movement that I was reading, from some of the different creationist authors who I was reading, I was just struck by, whoa, what an awesome God we have. His fingerprint is all over everything we see. So that really overwhelmed me for the arguments for God's existence. But when I started looking at some of the other major Christian apologists, some of the work that Dr. Geisler did, Dr. William Lane Craig on the Kalam argument, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then what you know is that that cause has to be spaceless, timeless, personal, has all these attributes that we say belong to God's character, his nature. And then with Dr. Geisler, and then more recently, Edward Feser, if you ever read any of Dr. Feser's book, like the Last Superstition, and in that it's a debunking of the new atheism. He goes through the thousands of pages, and he said these new atheists discard just with a line like, oh yeah, there's no real argument for God's existence. He's like, yeah, as long as you ignore the thousands and thousands of pages written over the last couple thousand years, yeah, there's nothing other than all those that you haven't even considered. So a dismissal is not a refutation. And then he goes through and just demonstrates, and I was first introduced to this by Dr. Geisler, and I think Dr. Geisler actually impacted Dr. Feser in these arguments, but basically the vertical argument for God's existence, that right now we need a sustaining cause because we're not sufficient to account for our existence. And then whatever that is, it has to be a necessary cause. Well, what follows from a necessary cause are all the divine attributes, his omnipotence, his omniscience, the fact he'd be immutable, so that's unchanging, and the fact that he doesn't change, he's pure act, and so that means there can only be one. And so the new atheists have like, well, how do you know that God's not a flying spaghetti monster? Because a flying spaghetti monster would be a material being, and he would have to move from one place to another, so he'd be flying. So there's so many ridiculous things with the flying spaghetti monster objection. It's just silly, especially when you look at the attributes of how God is necessarily based on the attributes we give to him, being immutable and so forth. All those things are also testified to in Scripture, but we could reason to it from philosophy. So it's very bolstering. Like when I started studying the arguments for God's existence, okay, certain attributes of God necessarily the case based on these metaphysical arguments for God's existence. And what do we find? They're the same attributes we find in Scripture, given to us at a low level, because most people don't have the time throughout world history to sit around and reflect on these arguments.
Yeah, but the first thing that I do when trying to have a conversation with somebody about the existence of God is that I try and first clarify what they mean by God. And so if you studied the worldview questions at all, this is the what is the nature of ultimate reality question in the worldview questions. Essentially, there's lots of people who have lots of different beliefs about God. Some people believe in the Muslim God, the Hindu gods, polytheistic, monotheistic. We need to first clarify who it is that they are talking about. What are the attributes of God that they're talking about before you start defending? Because I'm not interested in defending that any God exists. The only God who I'm willing to defend his existence is the actual God, and I think that that God has the attributes seen in the Scriptures.
Good point.
So I think the first thing that I would do with that person is outline some of those attributes of God. And so some of the ones that we see in the Scriptures are that God is the creator, that he pre-exists everything that had a beginning. He's the source of existence. The omnis that most people are familiar with, he's omnipresent, omnipotent, all-powerful, that he's personal. So those are the attributes of God that I think there are more than that in Scripture, but I think those ones are easily seen through philosophical arguments. So if those were the criteria that I was setting up, then the first argument that I would start with is what we would call an argument from cause and effect. Essentially, that God is the uncaused first cause. This argument goes that everything that begins to exist has a cause outside of itself. Now, I think one thing that we need to pause on in that point is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Sometimes people push back on this argument and they say everything that exists has to have a cause, so then God has to have a cause too. That's not what we're arguing here. Essentially, anything that's an effect has to have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause outside of its existence, and that cause is what we call God. What we're saying with that is essentially we have identified one attribute of God. We're not with that buying in the whole biblical God, we're buying in one of the attributes, which is that God is the cause of all of things that exist. Basically, God is the creator. He pre-exists everything that was created. I think that there's two things that support that. William Lane Craig did a really good job with this, with the Kalam cosmological argument and pushing back on the idea that the universe didn't have a beginning. Sometimes people object from that angle and they say, well, the universe didn't really have a beginning, so your argument falls flat. But I think the second law of thermodynamics actually helps support this, that order doesn't come from disorder. There's a natural tendency in isolated systems to degrade to disorder rather than to improve into order. And so what we also see with the universe is the universe is expanding, which implies that there was some starting point at which everything that has expanded originally was. And so these 2 points, I think, support the idea that there was a beginning to the universe. And if there was, in fact, a beginning, then the universe requires something to cause its existence. Now, this can't keep going on and on back forever. Otherwise, just like with the game of dominoes, you'd never have the first domino to push it back, to push down the rest of them. If there is a series of caused things, you have to have something at the beginning of the chain to start it all off. And that thing itself can't be caused. Otherwise, you would never have the chain started to begin the process altogether.
Okay, really good. So you've used a couple of illustrations from science that demonstrate that the universe had a beginning, but let's talk about that actual beginner, the one who began it. What else can you tell us about him?
Yeah, so with that one, we got that he's the uncaused first cause. I think then we can also, looking at this information, or looking from philosophy and just observing in nature, we can come to the idea that he's a necessary being. And what I mean by that is that there are things that are able to exist and there are things that are able to not exist. So there was a point in time in which both of us did not exist. There will be a point in time at which we will cease to exist again, which means that we are contingent beings. Our existence is contingent. If you want to think about it with the example of like maybe taking your daughter to the mall, you might say to your daughter, I'll take you to the mall, but it's contingent upon you cleaning your room. So there's something that is necessary to be the case before the contingent thing can be the case. Everything that is existence is distinct from its being, which means every being that either had a point when it didn't exist or has a point when it could cease to exist is considered a contingent being. And you can't have, once again, a infinite line of contingent beings. Otherwise, you never would get any of them. We know that there are contingent beings in the world, which means that logically it follows that there has to be at least one necessary being whose existence is not distinct from its being. Yeah, so I think is necessary then follows into another attribute of God that has to say is that God is existence itself. If he is uncaused and the cause of all things, and he is necessary, is a necessary being while we're all contingent, then he is existence itself. So all the beings, we think of ourselves as existing, and we think about our existence as essential to who we are. But actually, our existence is decoupled from our essence. Because of the fact there was a point in which we did not exist, and there is a point in which we will not exist again, our existence is able to be removed from who we are. It's not essential to who we are. There's a distinction between our essence and our existence. Or there's a distinction between, our essence and our existence is the way we would put it philosophically. In God, that distinction doesn't exist. His essence and existence are combined. So he is then existence itself, and then sources that to all beings that have existence. So what does that look like? You can think about your television. You have to plug it into the wall. It's sourcing its existence it's sourcing its power from the power outlet at every moment that it has power. It's similar to that in that every being whose essence and existence are distinct are sourcing their existence from God at every moment that they exist, which means that the biblical attribute of God as sustainer is then validated through what we understand about the nature of pure actuality and existence itself. Yes, I think the personal nature of God also plays out in the idea of his sustainability. If God is sustaining existence at every moment that everything exists, then he can't help but be personal. He is touching and sourcing everything that exists at every moment that it does, which means that he can't be like the deistic God. So some people believe that God front-loaded the universe, put all of the information in, spun it up, and then just let it unwind on its own and walked away to go do his own thing. If God is the sustainer, if he's sourcing existence to everything that exists at every moment, that's not even logically possible. God would have to be personally connected, personally involved in his creation at every moment that creation can continue to exist, because should he choose to withdraw himself from it, everything would just collapse back into nothingness again. So I think when people think of God, they traditionally think of the omnis. So they think of him being as omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, basically that he's all powerful, he knows all things, and he's everywhere. And we can once again see that as a consequence of God being existence itself. So if God is existence itself, then he is the source of all power that exists at every moment that anyone has power. There is no, this is kind of different than the idea of God being able to like stockpile the largest quantity of power. So sometimes people ask this question or surface this idea in the question of whether or not God could create a rock that's too big for him to lift. And they kind of feel like they can trap God because either he's not powerful enough to create this or he's not powerful enough to lift it. But that seems to imply that you're thinking about God as stockpiling the largest quantity of power, when in reality, all the power that there is, everything that has any power, at every moment it has it, is receiving that power from God. So this kind of plays out in the scriptures when it talks about how God is giving the governors or the rulers or the authorities the power that they had and the positions that they have for whatever purposes and whatever periods of time that they have it. This is like a cultural way that this omnipotence and God being the source of power is playing out in the scriptures. I think it also then plays out in relation to the omniscience and omnipresence. So if God is the sustainer, if he's sustaining your existence at every moment that you exist, then there is nothing that can be closer to you. There is nothing that can know you more personally and more deeply than the one who is the source of your existence. It's not that he is watching you through your windows and peering in to try and, observe what's going on so that he can have all his knowledge about you. It's that by virtue of being the source of your existence, he knows you even better than you could know yourself, and can be present to you. So he can be omnipresent. Sometimes people argue that omnipresent isn't a logical attribute because you can't have two different things in the same physical space at the same time. So you and God couldn't both be in your physical space at the same time. That would be illogical. But if God is the source of your existence, then he can't not be in the same space that you're in because he's there sourcing your existence at every moment. So it's not that you guys are both in the same physical space in the same way, that you guys are God is there by virtue of being the source of your existence and you being in that physical place.
You want your argument to give you theism. Now, there's lots of different kinds of arguments for the existence of God, but I'm going to go right to my favorite, which is known technically as the vertical cosmological argument. It's kind of what comes from Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways. Dr. Geiser championed it in a number of his books, including his Christian apologetics books. And I know that a lot of apologists like what is like the Kalam argument or the horizontal, and I'm not trying to dismount those or belittle those in any way, but you get theism with regards to the vertical cosmological argument for these reasons. Number one, it's completely dependent upon philosophy. Philosophy is something that transcends world views. It's not something that's tied to science, or it's not something that's tied to morality or other things that might involve worldviews or assumptions and things like that, it is actually demonstratable. And it's demonstratable in the sense that it gives us a necessary cause for finite changing things exist. If finite changing things exist, they can't cause themselves to exist. So that's causa sui, which is impossible. They can't be uncaused because, remember, we know the world. We know the truth about the world. We know things in the world. So they're not uncaused. And these are the kinds of things that can go out of existence. So therefore, they must be caused by another. You have to ask, well, what is that other? Well, it can't just be a collection of other things that are finite and changing, because that can't account for the whole. All those things need a cause outside themselves. So you have to posit something that's not finite and changing. And you go, well, what's not finite and changing? Well, that which is infinite and eternal or immutable, that doesn't change, needs to account for all the things that do exist. So very quickly, in just thinking about the world, reasoning through finite and changing things, we arrive at that necessary existence, or what is infinite, what is eternal, what is an unchanging, must account for the entirety of the world. So there you've established theism right there, because what I mean by theism is not just a first cause that you might get from the Kalam cosmological argument. We get unchanging, eternal, infinite. We get all these attributes that must be attributed to God. And that's what I mean by theism is being established with respect to God. This is the most important point of all the 12 points. And I didn't just say that. I got that from my teacher. So I'm not just making that up. The guy that made the 12 points said that the third point is the most important. Everything's going to flow from that. We're going to view history. We're going to view the New Testament. We're going to view Jesus. We're going to view Judaism. We're going to view all these things from a theistic standpoint, miracles from a theistic standpoint. From now on in the points, we have a theistic worldview that's established. And that means we have shown by our truth claim that theism is true, that everything opposed to it, that means atheism is false, pantheism is false, panentheism is false, finite godism is false, and all the other isms that are opposed to theism are false and off the page in terms of the rest of the points.
So I've always liked science. My undergrad's in mathematics, and that's actually in some ways what led me to apologetics was when we were doing, the cosmological argument, and this is the argument from Origins, and we're looking at why the universe has to have a cause and the fact that time cannot be infinite. Like there cannot be an infinite number of moments today. So as a mathematician, it resonated with me because we play with infinite as a concept, but then to recognize, well, you can't actually have an infinite number of things, which I always knew that. But then to apply that, that's why the universe has to have a beginning. That's why time can't be infinite. I grasped those pretty quickly. My students sometimes are not as quick to jump on these things. They may not enjoy them as much as I do. But in terms of knowing that God is the origin of the universe, that's the whole idea of the cosmos and the cosmological argument. But also even the science that goes into intelligent design and the design argument, the teleological argument, the fact that God made the universe with this design, and we talk DNA, we talk about the species. As a science person, this resonates. Like, this is where the creation is telling us about the creator, and we don't have to follow the erroneous conclusions of the scientists that are in many ways shutting their eyes to the data. And that's why they say, there's no evidence for God. Well, if you ignore it, then there's no evidence. But the evidence in some ways speaks for itself, calling us to recognize, that I love in the movie Prometheus, they make the point that when they were on a planet, this is part of the Alien trilogy thing, when they were going to a planet, they saw straight lines, and they're like, there must be a base there because nature doesn't make straight lines. And so even just with straight lines, they recognize a mind must have been there. And it's like, we have more of compelling evidence than just straight lines for why there is a God who ordered the universe.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. And so now, Dr. McCuddy, let me push back just a second to get you to go a little deeper. But I see, trolls on social media when people are posting Christian content and apologetics, I see the trolls try to push back against design argument. I really don't think that's possible. You know, design demands a designer. That you really only, do you even have another option? And if so, what is the absurdity of that option? What's your take on that?
So I think our problem is we're so accustomed to living within the already designed functioning system that seeing new species and new things develop from this already functioning system, it seems plausible. So that's why when I teach my students and I talk about, you know, how do we demonstrate God from design, we go to the fact that the universe and life itself are design. And then the most compelling thing is, well, what does it take to get life going? And when you picture our planet, you're probably picturing vegetation of some sort. Let's say it's life. It's before that. So what do you have before vegetation, before any biologicals? I mean, what the forces you have, like, I mean, and I think Geisler mentions those. You got like gravity, you got weak nuclear force, strong nuclear force, electromagnetism. Like, there's not much. And the whole idea that everything would come together inside of a cell wall and be perfectly balanced, because when amoebas are deformed, you know, they die. Like, that's what happens. All this had to come together. And I think what happens with most people, whether they're trolls or even just well-meaning people who don't understand, like one gentleman who's like, well, you know, if I have a pond in my backyard and I don't touch it, something will come out eventually. And it's like, because you already have a functioning system. And take people back and to think, and it does require a little bit of science. This is why we run a homeschool co-op, and I'm like, here's why you need to understand a little bit of how the world functions, because a lot of people who many times will troll, they don't understand the science that's behind it. They're coming from a place of ignorance rather than, I think sometimes people close their eyes, but sometimes they just don't know. And when we deal with the design and we deal with the science, a lot of people are just unaware of how things would have been and how they work. And I think this is important for the Christian mind, why our kids need to understand science and these things, because, and I do not remember who said it, but someone said, you know, a little bit of science will make you an atheist, but a lot of science will lead you to God. And I believe that's very much the case. I think I do like the moral argument. I think in terms of engaging with people on the street, the moral argument is the better place to start, because like I said, people don't always know the science. So I can't talk about those things unless somebody knows them. So the moral argument actually provides a better gateway, because everybody has this sense that the world is in bad shape. Everybody, no matter how raging a relativist they are, they're going to have something that they say, it just shouldn't be that way. They ought not do that. And in a world without God, I tell them there's no basis in which you can truly say that. All you can say is you don't like it. You may not think it's best, but you can't say it's wrong, and you can't say it's evil. So this is why one of the best helps with the moral argument I have found recently has been the Marvel movies. Because even if people haven't seen the Marvel movies, they're pretty much aware of Thanos and snapping and destroying half the universe. And I've had conversations on the street with people asking, okay, in a world without God, why is Thanos wrong? Why is it actually wrong to destroy half the universe? Because we're not actually dealing with good and evil. We're just dealing with a difference of perspective and how you should handle goods and distribution.
Yeah. Right.
And for a lot of people, they get kind of upset. You know, there's this visceral reaction. They're like, it's obviously wrong. And I said, obvious to who? And I said, there's something within us that calls us to recognize that there is genuine good. There is evil that should not be. And that is where this evil that has corrupted the creation calls out to the creator who did make it good and one day will make it right. And so that's why with those three arguments, we have a creation that says, hey, it needed a beginner, somebody who designed it. And when we look at it, we recognize something went wrong. That's when we can, I can tell you, I say, hey, I have insider information. I can tell you exactly what went wrong and what the solution is.
Okay, this has been points 3, 4, and 5 of the 12 points that show Christianity is true. We just covered point 3, the theistic God exists. Point 4, if God exists, miracles are possible. And point 5, miracles can be used to confirm a message from God. Be sure to check out the next video on point 6, the New Testament documents are historically reliable. From there, we go forward to talk about Jesus specifically and the text of Scripture and showing how that the Bible is trustworthy. And once all of these points 1 through 11 are understood, then you're in a position to understand clearly the final point, point 12, that therefore Christianity is true, the Bible is true, and anything that is opposed to it is false. These are the 12 points that show Christianity is true. Check out point 6 on the next video.